This is how you cross over from Israel to Gaza, and right now we're in no man's land. Prime Minister, do you now regret when once asked what your favourite joke was, you replied, Nick Clegg? And Deputy Prime Minister, what do you think of that?
Mr. Trump, why should you be president? What makes you fit for the role? Is it just one big ego trip?
Thank you very much.
People aren't sure they can trust what you say. You say things and then it turns out that they're not quite what you said.
And if we deliver what we say we're going to deliver.
My name's Andy Bell and I've been a journalist for over 30 years. In this podcast series, How Did We Get Here?, I talk to someone who can provide background, context and insight for a big story in the news. This week, I'm in Florida with the presidential election looming. I've been talking to Susan MacManus from the University of Southern Florida. She spent a lifetime examining how Florida votes, in particular the central belt of Florida, which usually decides which way this vital state will swing. She's also a lifelong resident of that central belt with an experience and knowledge of Florida which is lived, not just studied. We went to see her at the house outside Tampa where she lives and which her grandfather built in the 1920s.
I was born here and my mother was born here, so I'm a second generation Floridian.
So we've got Donald Trump and Joe Biden in town coming here same day. Why do they think this is a place they have to come at this point in the election?
Florida has 10 media markets and the Tampa media market is the largest of the 10. It's also the most divided politically. This market plus the Orlando market forms that famous highway called the I-4 corridor. And these are the two largest media markets in the state, and they're also the most evenly divided. It's why they're called the swing part of the swing state. But Tampa has a really rich diversity in terms of its race and ethnic composition, its age composition, party identification, economy, suburb, rural, urban. It really is a microcosm of the state.
Can I just ask you, when you talk about media market, that's not a term necessarily that for a British audience we kind of get what you mean. Can you just explain what that is?
It's the way you figure out for a television, how far is the reach of a television audience or waves, you could say it better. But
Well, like a local station?
Right. And this is a 10 county media market. So it goes all the way down to Sarasota and up as high as Citrus. So it's 10 counties, and then Orlando's, I believe, is 7 or 8.
So does that mean coming here is like the most efficient way to sort of get to the biggest reach of TV viewers?
You're right. If you come here, you can have the broadest reach of TV viewers. You can reach 1/4 of all 14.4 million registered voters in this state. 1/4 of them you can reach with a visit to Tampa.
What sort of a voting bloc is it? You were talking about it being very diverse.
You have a sizable black communities, a sizable Hispanic community, and it's not all Cubans, even though the heritage is Cuban. There are now more non-Cuban Latinos living in this area. You also have tremendous age divide. You have college campuses and you have retirement villages like Sun City Center. And so you get the age divide and the race and ethnic divide, but you also get some economic divide and where people live. The suburban outlying counties are home to a lot of lower middle income people with families and children. And in those particular markets, they tend to lean Republican, but it's the suburban mom with kids that's usually the swing vote because she usually picks a candidate whose platform or points are in sync with what she thinks is going to be best for her children. So right now we're watching them very closely because there's a lot of debate among households as to whether their children should be going back to brick and mortar schools or whether having to study online or whether there should be a choice. And they're also the households that are most affected by any kind of layoffs, those middle income families, homes.
Florida's always a swing state. This part of Florida is the bit that swings most, if I can put it like that. If you get it right here, do you get Florida?
That's been the pattern for quite some time, and it is obviously the two candidates believe that it's still the swing part of the state, or they wouldn't be here in the waning hours of their campaign where they could be at a lot of other places, even in Florida.
I mean, is that the way it's worked in the past? I mean, in previous elections, for instance?
Yes, it has been that way. The I-4 corridor together has been the swing part of the swing state. And let's face it, Florida is the largest prize out there. 29 of the 270 required electoral votes are right here in Florida. And when you consider that the states that have more electoral votes than we do, they're solidly one party or another. Texas, red, Republican, and California, New York, blue, but Florida, deep, deep, deep purple.
And the winner takes all, of course.
Yes, the winner takes all.
Even if you win by just a couple of thousand votes, you get all 29 electoral college votes.
Yes, you do.
Which, if you're looking for 270, which is what you need, it's more than 10% of what you need.
Right, it is. It's nearly 11%. Yes, it is.
Okay.
And year in and year out, it's like this. You know, everyone thinks Florida and elections, and they go back to the 2000 presidential election, which was only 537 votes difference between George Bush and Al Gore, and went to the Supreme Court to be finally certified. We're probably not going to have that close of an election this time, but it's going to be close. And no one quite believes the polls because they were so wrong in 2016. And no one quite believes that as many as 7 or 8% are really undecided, not in a state where there's been politics non-stop for over a year.
Well, you think most people have made up their minds? Well, that's an exaggeration of the number of undecideds.
I think some of them simply do not want to reveal to a pollster which way they're leaning. And those would probably be more likely to be Trump voters.
Is it also about getting people actually to vote? If it's a question of you don't think there are many undecideds left, is that what the campaigns now have to do?
Yes, it is. They're looking at people who are wavering. At this point, it's all about making sure that people who are for them or leaning in their direction actually carry through with voting. You know, people get busy, or they see polls one day that says that the candidate that they want is already going to win, so they don't need to go vote. Those are the danger spots, and that's why these candidates are here at the last minute, so to speak, is trying to make sure that any wavering person gets to the polls. And this early voting period ends this weekend. Now you can vote at a lot of different places all over the counties if they have an early voting site. But once it's election day, you have to vote in a specific location. And sometimes that's a little bit more difficult for people to get to that location if they're a long ways away working. So they're here to try to get people to vote early, finish it up before the weekend. And if they're wavering, by all means, make sure that if they don't vote early, that they absolutely vote on election day. It's one thing to tell a pollster that you're for a candidate, but that doesn't really help if you don't carry through with it.
I mean, let me ask you about early voting, because there's clearly a record number of people voting early, either in person or by mail. What do you read into that?
A lot of it is because of COVID. And a lot of it is because, frankly, Floridians have been saturated with political news and mailers and calls and tweets and everything else, text for months on end, and pretty much have their minds made up and they just want it over with. The interesting thing is, this year, it was Democrats who really pushed their supporters hard to vote by mail, and Republicans pushing more early in-person voting or in-person on election day. Reverse roles. In the past, it was always Republicans pushing vote by mail and Democrats leaning more towards early voting.
So why is that? Why that switch?
A lot of it was because President Trump kept talking badly about the fraud and problems possibly that could emerge with mail ballots. He ultimately was forced by a lot of Florida elected officials to admit and say publicly, I'm not talking about Florida for vote by mail problems. I'm talking about other places, other states, which for the first time this election year are going to have extensive vote by mail ballots coming in, and they don't even have a law that lets them start opening them and running through machines until election day.
So President Trump had to say, when I'm talking about mail-in ballot fraud, I don't mean Florida, not you guys.
Exactly. And now the best thing that's happened is the emergence of drop boxes. If you ask for a vote by mail ballot, which millions did, But you're worried all of a sudden about the mail delivery because there's been a lot of problems with mail delivery. But yet you do not want to go into an early voting site in person on election day for fear of COVID. What has happened now is there are these drop boxes, kind of like a mailbox, but just a drop box where you can drive up and put your ballot into that box and be assured that they're going to go to the election official and they'll be counted, and you don't have to worry about some sort of infection from COVID. So it's really worked out very well. I doubt we'll ever go back to a day we don't have them.
So who do you think is benefiting from all this early voting?
Well, it's really interesting because they like to do almost hourly counts on this. It's very easy to track. And of course, early on, because Democrats stressed early voting so much, vote by mail, they were way ahead, as the days progressed. And now that early voting has started, Republicans are starting to catch up. And there's a lot of warning on the part of Democrats not to fixate so much on those numbers because there's only 134,000 more Democrats than Republicans out of 14.4 million in the state. And what we also don't see enough attention to as analysts are the 26% who are not registered as Democrats nor Republicans. And do you know how they're going to vote? No, you don't. So all this proclamation that it's a sure thing for Democrats is kind of dangerous. That was what happened with Hillary Clinton. A lot of her supporters just didn't show up because they thought she was going to win easily. That can happen.
And in Florida, they're already counting before we get to the day of the election. So we should get that result, including all the early voting,
Yes.
on the night.
Yes, we should be early. However, it's very important that people understand that election night is not likely to be the final tally if it's close. There are 3 legal reasons why everything's not counted by election night end. One is that by federal law, if you're overseas or a military or personnel, your vote does not have to be in to an election official until 10 days after the election. Well, Florida has a large military presence. Secondly, if you go to an early voting site and you don't have your ID on you, they'll let you vote what's called a provisional ballot, and then you have to supply proof that you are who you are later on. But that kind of sorting out of provisional ballots isn't done until after the election. And then the third is if you have an onslaught of last-minute absentee ballot or vote-by-mail ballots arriving on election day, officials cannot open them because they have to check the signatures to see that they match. We have bets among the voters here about how long it will be before Florida is certified, because everybody remembers the 36 days in the 2000 election.
With George Bush and
I don't think you're going to see that this time.
Okay.
And frankly, Florida election officials are really hoping that for once, we are not the focal point of problems after the election.
Because you have been in the past.
We would like to shed that reputation.
Someone like
that
Michigan or
tracks
Wisconsin
back
can
20
have that.
years, yes.
Okay. And is it fair to say that whoever wins Florida is probably going to be president?
It's not as sure a thing as it used to be, but we have a very good track record for that. But let's face it, this is the most unusual year ever, and honestly, political scientists are going to have to rewrite textbooks right and left. This is not your typical election.
Okay, well, I'm going to ask a very naughty question, which is, who do you think is going to win Florida then?
I can't say that I know. It's just that close. When you've had polls in the last 2 days which shows one of them up by 4 and another one up by 4 off and on, who can really say definitively? But there is a stock answer that we always give to a question like that, and the answer is the one with the most votes.
I guess we can agree on that one. Okay. All right. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Susan MacManus with her priceless insight into what may happen in Florida in just a few days. Thanks very much for listening. If you have thoughts on this or ideas for any other podcast, please email me on andy.bell@itn.co.uk, and I'm tweeting at @AndyBell5News. I hope you've enjoyed this edition of How Did We Get Here? There'll be another along soon.